Good afternoon, everyone. Brian, City of the Immaculata here. In this live, it's going to be a continuation of where we left off last time in this talk on the Middle Ages. Last time we were discussing the people, and now I would like to scale back again and take an even broader approach of the age. This age, the labeling of it as the Dark Ages, as I'm sure you've all heard it as addressed before, I really think needs to be reassessed at a popular level. Academia, it seems, has all but abandoned the Dark Ages as a useful term, but those kind of circles are somewhat cloistered, and it takes a long time for stereotypes to be purged from common lingo and the common perception. Um, Especially, I mean, I guess the movie's a little bit older now, but like when you get directors from Hollywood, and Hollywood I know is its own thing, but it can speak for popular narratives, if you will. And when you got directors like Ridley Scott making that really, really awful ahistorical movie on the Crusades, I can't even think of what it was called. It's not even worth remembering. And I think it was universally panned. I think it was panned because it was actually a bad movie, but it also should be panned for its misrepresentation of what the Crusades were, just as an example. And we'll speak about the Crusades at the end here, but there is possibly still a context for which we could refer to the area as dark in the sense that it may be helpful, but the tendency to extract greater meaning from a very specialized term is just too common. So much so that I think it would probably be better just to drop the term altogether. And that's sort of a long-term project, a long-term fantasy of mine, is that one day we'll just stop using the term the Dark Ages. But all right, since we're stuck with it, let's kind of look at it a little bit closer. The term itself was coined by the 14th century Italian scholar Francesco Petrarch. And Petrarch was a part of this emerging class of humanists who were interested in studying classical texts from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, a ressourcement of its day. Now, his lament was that after the fall of Western Rome, you really stopped seeing the type of classical literature that was so common in the ancient world. Now, my assessment is that Petrarch himself was, even if only mildly, taking a jab at the eventual Christianizing of Europe, implying that things grew dark as Europe became more and more Christian. So from there, the term grew to mean the entire Middle Ages, from the fall of Rome right up until the Protestant Reformation, though at points the term has been used in scholarly sources, and this is what I was getting at in the first point I was making, to refer to a specific area between the fall of Rome and roughly the turn of the millennium, roughly the year, roughly around 1000, when the availability of sources are really scant and few. In this sense, I think there's a usefulness to the term for scholars when addressing the difficulties academically of evaluating certain features of the time. But it's important to note that it is in no way a classification of the culture or the people themselves when it's used this way. Of course, it has been used as such many times since it was coined. Protestant rhetoric, so conscious of their need to legitimize themselves due to their embarrassing absence in the historical Christian and their absence in Christian history. They found it useful to denigrate this time, as did historians after the Enlightenment period, to likewise legitimize their hostile takeover of culture and its monuments. But for both the French Revolution and for the Protestant Revolution, they were both keen on taking over church property. And to this day, most of the Roman Catholic Church property, historic property in France, for example, is owned by the French government, including places like Notre Dame and the Cluny Monastery. So they saw it in their interest to barbarize, right, to coin my own term, to barbarize the medieval people in order to justify what was ultimately the unjustifiable acts they were committing. Sort of a propaganda effort to denigrate your enemies. Now, we talked a little last time about the title, how the title wasn't even proper necessarily for the peasant people themselves, though illiterate they may be. Go back and watch that video as for the case that I made for them. But in this, I want to take a look at the areas in which this era is supposed to be dark. Typically, they're implying that the time was dark or marked by ignorance and superstition in the areas of historical sources, art and architecture, literature, science, religion, and religious practices. So let's take a look at these areas and see if what is said about them is correct. So first, historical sources. Now, granted, we never have enough sources in history as we would like to have. So many of the stories that we rely upon for saying things about a period, we only have fragments of a singular source. And sometimes that's if we're lucky. Oftentimes, we only have later references to an ancient source. For example, we have 250 surviving manuscripts of Plato, yet we know from other sources that there were more extant writings that are just lost to history. And this is a problem all throughout history. This is not unique to the medieval period. Ancient, medieval, modern to an extent. And what has survived, we're very grateful to the monks who preserved this stuff for us before the advent of the printing press, because what has survived for us is in some ways a miracle that we have anything from the ancient world when you consider all of the forces surrounding the destruction of some of these ancient manuscripts. It's amazing we have anything. Okay, but are the historical sources for this period really as bad as the reputation implies? Well, not really. To start with, and I'm just going to run through some examples here of what we have. To begin with, we have, for example, the great Venerable Bede in his Ecclesial History of England, a standard of historiographical writing moving forward. I mean, Bede, while certainly biased towards a specific reading of English history, is still, even among secular historians, a trove of useful dates and peoples and events. Bede kind of set the standard moving forward. As well, we have Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks. It's not well appreciated enough just how important this first order of the church is to our Catholic history moving forward. And Gregory provides us with contemporary firsthand witness that's extremely useful. You also have the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. You have multiple sources for the Gothic Wars, including from the Gothics, the barbarians themselves, including the Vandals, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. You have Muslim sources for Al-Andalus, and you have Paul the Deacon's history for the Lombards of northern Italy, right? So we have quite a plethora of sources. All things considered, we have a pretty good idea of what was happening in the courts, on the battlefield, in the church. It's not bad, and it's not nearly as bad as it's presented. And even where there are challenges, like, I mean, in it's further east, but for example, there's a controversy over when and how the Greeks used this famous weapon of Byzantium called Greek fire. Apparently, it was a kind of napalm that the Greeks used very effectively in battle, and its recipe was a tightly held state secret that's lost to us today. But even the chroniclers add confusion because we're not entirely for sure if it was used in two very distinct battles far removed from each other, or if the battles are actually won and they've been confused by the sources themselves. So, as with anything in history, there are challenges, but again, we're very fortunate to have what we do have, and it's much more. There's an archive, if I can find it, a wonderful archive for historical sources of the medieval period, and it's pretty vast. Second, what about art and architecture? Okay, so I think that even the most ignorant, maybe not the most ignorant, but even people that are superficially aware of history are beginning to acknowledge that the medieval period produced fantastic art and especially architecture. Your average normie, ignorant tourist can easily travel today and witness with their own eyes the grandeur that is the medieval cathedral. And even the most, I'm picturing some like self-absorbed teen girl or boy who barely looks up from their cell phone when they're walking through the streets of Paris. As they're traveling, they take pictures of themselves in front of these monuments, to post for their Instagram. Even that person, I have to imagine that even for a split second, as they look up and they see the grandeur of a Notre Dame or a Chartres, for example, they have to, for that split second, have a moment, right, of awe of the people who built and maintained these magnificent structures. Now, some medieval art may be a little more inaccessible or less relatable given the growth of the cult of the artist in modernity since the Renaissance. Yet, still, at least in academia, there is an acknowledgement that the art of the so called barbarians is quite spectacular and quite brilliant. I covered the Book of Kells on this channel, right? Go and watch that video. While that has its roots in ancient Celtic artistry, it is certainly a product of medieval Christianity and surpasses, in my opinion, anything from the Renaissance. But, art's a very subjective thing. So what about literature? Literature, right? This was Francisco Petrarch's personal lament. He was interested in ancient literature, and he lamented that the art of literature had died in this dark age, as he coined. Though I would keep in mind that cultural literature is always first born out of a strong oral tradition first. Even Homer's magnificent literary poems, Iliad and the Odyssey, were begun as oral recitations. So while certain, say Germanic tribes may not have left us a hefty literary tradition, we certainly know that they would have had strong oral traditions of stories and myths and legends, as any tribe of the human race does. The first and most obvious, though, of this period, as far as what was written and left to us, was of course Beowulf, one of the great literary efforts of all history, which was no doubt a transcription of an earlier oral legend, as I was stating. As well, we have the popular legends emerging of Arthur and his knights of Camelot. There's the Canterbury Tales, and the one that resonates all over, of course, is the great story of Robin Hood, born out of these medieval courtly love type poems and stanzas. There's the French work, The Song of Roland, another epic tale. You also get the rise, as I just mentioned, of courtly love and romantic tales coming out of this time, due in part to the rise of the knightly class after the crusading period. Now, it trends the cusp of what some historians would refer to as medieval, but I would certainly place Dante's great epic poem, The Divine Comedy, within the late medieval literature. And certainly that's one of the great classic works of history. Personally, I don't think you get the modern concept of literature until something like Cervantes' Don Quixote. But hopefully, this lets you see that literature and oral tradition, and especially, was absolutely a part of the medieval life. All right, so how about science? This is certainly a time when scientists were burnt as witches across the board, right? That's what we were raised on. That's what we were told. Well, first, you have to consider how the medieval people view something like science. And this is a wide, vast topic in and of itself. This you could bring on a good Thomist or a good like Franciscan who could talk to you about just the field of what science meant for medieval learning. For the most part, all of medieval history is a renaissance, if you will. If a renaissance, by renaissance we mean a ressourcement back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, because the medieval people themselves viewed ancient Greece and Rome as the ideal. So something like Aristotle and his physics, or his views on anatomy or zoology, were for the most part accepted within what we would today refer to as the natural sciences, within that scope. The word science, of course, for medieval people had a different connotation than it has today. And like I said, I would bring on an expert for that because it's such a wide topic. I mean, science to them was not this strict category or discipline that limited itself just to the mechanistic material world around us. You think about science today, and it's been so narrowed down that today science is really just a series of classifications of observable events that we try to predict and make conclusions about, right? We live in the aftermath of men like Descartes and Hume and Kant, who sought to divorce metaphysics, they sought to divorce the mechanical processes of the world from metaphysics. Yet Newton himself, who so revolutionized math and physics, acknowledged in a famous quote of his that if he has seen further than anyone else, it's because he stands on the shoulders of giants. And that's a beautiful acknowledgement of the debt that modern science owes to its predecessors. Pierre Duhem, in his famous work on the history of science, acknowledges that it was the advancement of many critical thinkers beginning in the great medieval universities that paved the way for all other scientific endeavors, including the scientific method itself. And all the technological and medical advances that we've been using since have their antecedent in the medieval university period. Now, many honest scientists today are beginning to acknowledge that science needs a philosophy of science to truly move mankind forward in any kind of direction that is not completely isolated from human endeavors like morals and ethics. Not even just that, but answering questions like the problem of consciousness. Those that accept that it is a problem also accept that the traditional scientific method offers no real solution for accounting for something like the emergence of consciousness. And I mean, if you'd have gone back and brought this up to a fourth, fifth, or sixth year student in medical university, they'd have replied like, I mean, we're talking fourth, fifth, sixth century medical student. They'd have replied like, yeah, of course, right? Duh. The philosophical basis was well established in the medieval period. And we are still attempting to build upon it today. I mean, all of the great 20th century theological thinkers recognized the importance of these great scholastic minds of medieval Europe. And even if there weren't the sort of leaps and bounds of technological advances being made that we've made since the Industrial Revolution, that really says nothing about the advances of what they did make. Music, for example, right? You don't just get the great harmonic innovations of a Bach without a Boethius writing on music centuries earlier. Nor would you get it without the development of polyphony out of the great monastic chanting traditions of medieval Europe. Galileo himself was successful due to the invention of a more powerful telescope, which was itself the product of a optical lens from late medieval Europe invented by Nicholas of Cusa. So lastly, I just want to touch upon what about religion and religious practices? I mean, like certainly these were the dull, superstitious ignoramuses who, drowned witches and set up little inquisitions all over the place, right? Well, in a word, no, not exactly. Now, again, there are certainly times when religious fervor lent itself to extremes, like the flagellants who, after the Black Plague, took the sins of others upon themselves and penitentially whipped themselves in the streets daily to atone for sins. Yet the church instantly condemned that practice. You also had pogroms against Jewish people and Jewish communities due to this phenomenon called blood libel. You also have a hyper apocalypticism during the Middle Ages, and some of them had some pretty cringe views on sexuality and women. But I mean, really, if you stop and sort of remove yourself from where we stand today, do we really fare much better? Do I dare point out what the hedons who march in these parades do to themselves publicly today? Or what about the atrocities committed against Jews by atheist Russia or atheist Germany in recent history? Or what about the apocalyptic atheist Jim Jones in his Jonestown and that massacre, right, in the 70s? Or what about our own views today on sexuality or womanhood? Honestly, I mean, you start looking at these things, do we really fare that much better than the medieval people did? So beyond the stereotypes, though, they really weren't I mean, just for example, they really weren't on like constant witch hunts. That really, you don't see the witch hunts until much later. Really, and not even until that's more of a modern phenomenon after the Protestant Reformation. Nor was the Inquisition really a thing. I mean, the Inquisition, depending on how you age and place these things, the Inquisition was more of a product of modernity with the fall of Al-Andalus and the rise of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century. What you do have in medieval religion is a high degree of speculation, a robust engagement with various, including various non-Christian ideas. You have some of the most robust philosophical metaphysical inquiries that humanity has ever achieved. One has only had to spend some time with some of the commentaries on Lombard's sentences to see this, be they by a Thomas or a Bonaventure or a Scotus or an Alexander of Hales or any of the others of that time. I would match and pit them against anything that's produced by the modern era from Kant forward. As well, religious practice was quite admirable for the people of medieval times, and that's going to be the third part, right? So to kind of leave you with what's going to be next, for the medieval ages, part three, we're going to look at in-depth medieval piety, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? All three. But piety and devotion in the Middle Ages really marked the lives and actions of medieval people, and the church was ever vigilant in combating the excesses of certain extreme devotions, be that from the flagellants or there was a Franciscan breakoff group called the Spirituals or whomever, right? While at times also allowing for smaller and more strict observances of piety that you might find from like the Carthusians or the Franciscan observance. So that medieval church, yes, there's excesses, but you see the church trying to rein those excesses in while also allowing for, usually these more extreme ascetical groups were much smaller, but the church was pretty clear, right? So long as you followed some guidelines and you didn't go too far in your excesses and you didn't demand these extreme ascetical practices on other people's, the church allowed for wiggle room for some of those more observant reforms. The church, I would say overall, and Robert Bellarmine notes this, the church was lax, the yoke was light enough, yet still vigilant when addressing the lesser extremes. There was quite a few pious practices. I think I'm going to save that for the next lecture because I want to have like a nice list for you guys of what medieval piety really looked like. I don't have my notes ready for that. But as far as the laxity of the laws, I mean, for example, one just has to turn to one of the Lateran councils. I think it was the Fourth Lateran Council, where the church's four precepts were established. And if you noticed, the precepts of the church are not that hard, right? They noticed at the time that a practice had begun wherein the laity, out of a certain pious devotion that had arisen, the laity were becoming so devout that they were understandably beginning to refrain from reception to the point that some would go years without receiving. So now at the council, the church decrees, right, this ecclesial precept that while it's not a moral law, it's not like the Ten Commandments, so the church can dispense with them. So for all of you that were like freaking out, I'm not saying you guys, but for the ones that were freaking out during the pandemic that the bishops were violating God's law by closing parishes, those people don't know what they're talking about. Just be glad you didn't live in the time of when interdicts were being enforced on certain areas. But the idea was to keep the laws so that Christ himself said, "My yoke is light." So you keep the laws light so that people wouldn't have so much placed on them that you're barring people from heaven. All right. And the precepts were pretty easy, right? Since people were not receiving because out of this fear, it was you have to receive once a year at Easter. And then it became, okay, well, in order to receive, you have to have had a good confession. So at least once a year, you have to confess. This is suggested during Lent so that you could be prepared to receive during Easter. So that's just an idea of like the church sort of the medieval piety and devotions and the church sort of reining them in, correcting them, and allowing a lot of leeway for people to practice their own devotions. Let's see. And I want to be careful here because there's holy people in all generations of the church, even today. Believe it or not, even today, there's holy people. But pound for pound, per capita, I'd weigh the piety and devotion of the average medieval parish against just about any parish here in the United States today, traditionalist or otherwise. The average peasant in his tiny little parish probably knew scripture better than many do today, probably had a much higher view of the sacraments than many do today, especially the Eucharist, probably prayed more consistently and with more devotion. So, again, like all these other areas, I'd weigh them against modernity, and you may be surprised at the results that you would find. One last point I want to bring up here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there are really good popular level historians that are sort of taken the mantle of this one and challenged what's been the narrative for the last 100 plus years, and that's just the Crusades. The Crusades, in a nutshell, were really just a belated Christian attempt at responding to the rise of Islam. All right. Islam kind of comes up, rises out of nowhere, seemingly, conquers a vast, vast portion of area, including areas that were historically Christian. And the Crusades were a late response to that. The uniqueness to the Crusades, though, is that it helped to solidify Western European identity because the Crusades were called by and more often than not orchestrated by or at least around this idea of the papacy, right? And I mean, you could turn to like a Stephen Wyden. There's some popular levels of the Crusades and the history being told from a much better vantage point where you could assess a little bit better than just these evil Christians wanting to go destroy and raid and pillage defenseless Muslims. So I would just turn you to some other sources for that, but it's worth bringing up because it's another thing about the Dark Ages, right? And these insane crusaders. Well, there's always more. There's two sides to every story, and the Christian Europe had its side to the story as well. So that's what I got. We've covered historical sources, we've covered art, architecture, literature, science, religion. Hopefully you walk away from these talks with a little more appreciation and maybe a little less judgment against people of medieval Europe. And if I'm really successful, maybe you have a little bit of admiration for them, even as in some ways they deserve our admiration. Let's see. All right, so we got no comments. I've got a few things lined up that I'm thinking about doing for this series. One, I want to do a multi-part series on Western monastic orders from the Benedictines all the way up through to the Franciscans. And I think I'm actually going to pre-record that and present that with slides because there's just so much information. So that one's going to be a little while coming. But the next in this series of lives, I think I'm going to do medieval piety. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this. The last one seemed to be quite popular to my surprise and amazement, but that's a good thing because I think that just shows that people are interested in reevaluating and learning about the Middle Ages in a way that's not seen through the lens of Protestants with a objective to denigrate the Middle Ages or through the lens of Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment thinkers that are also seeking to denigrate the Middle Ages. When we sort of step back from those two standard narratives where most of the history books have been written, and we begin to assess, while it's not a perfect period, no period of history is a perfect period, it is a history that we can begin to appreciate and admire for some of what they had that we have since lost, that I think in a lot of ways a great recovery of Catholicism is not just a recovery of Tridentine Catholicism, though we have certainly lost some of our Tridentine elements. I think greater than even that, even though the Tridentine reforms are necessary, and I always have to be careful about how I, say these things, even though the Tridentine reforms are necessary, even greater than that, I think a recovery of our great medieval heritage, be it art and architecture, be it in the sciences and the way that they viewed philosophy and metaphysics and how they tied all of these things together, and the great scholastic and university learning and the inquiries that came out of that period, be it simple religious and pious practices, right? Piety is, we've got modernity is just such a mess. It's such a nightmare trying to navigate modernity. I've just picked up a book from the library. It's a biography of Teresa of Avila, and I would place her more in. She's sort of on that cusp of the old world and modernity, but I would place her more in. She's part of the Tridentine reform, so I would place Teresa more in modernity. But even she is just like there's this. And it's an interesting biography because you're getting some of the practices that are taking place around her in Spain at this time, and some of those pious practices, while I don't lament the loss of many of them, I do lament the loss of some of them. And and a Teresa of Avila, she's a wonderful source for pulling that, like, some of the truly good out of what came out of the medieval world. And the best, what I was getting at with this as far as modernity goes, we have this, and I don't want to, like, denigrate these people or challenge their holiness or their sanctity or their piety, but coming out of that 1970s charismatic movement, so influenced by Protestantism, it's a shame that the Catholics felt that that's what they had to turn to find a charismatic renewal. Though the best of it, I will say, to be fair to the charismatics, the best of them they weren't so much interested in Azusa Street revival charismatic renewal as they were interested in the religious practices of a Saint Teresa of Avila. So the best of it did try to draw from Avila, but I don't think that was the norm in the charismatic movement. So, like, we as a Catholics could pull from these much older sources, even going back before the Tridentine reforms. Though we have to be careful because, like I said, I don't want to see Catholics in the streets. I don't want to see the return of the flagellant movement, right? That was condemned before, and the church would rightly condemn it if it began now. But I'm going to go into piety next time because I do think it's an important thing for us to try to restore Catholic piety that's authentic and ancient and efficacious, right? That's the most important thing out of all of this is it efficacious? Does it lead to our holiness and our sanctity? So anyways, everyone, take care. That's all I got. Let me see what I'm at here. Yeah, I'm coming up to 40 minutes, close enough. The Dark Ages, it's embarrassing scholars still use that word. Anthony Rodriguez. Yeah, I agree, Anthony. And I think scholars are turning away from it. I would say most scholars, you won't see them refer to it as the Dark Ages. I've even seen quite a few secular historians showing a deep admiration for the medieval period, which I just love to see. I love to see when you see secular historians kind of turning back and going, well, maybe the Protestants didn't tell us everything accurately or truthfully, right? Maybe there's some things to admire. And I've seen quite a few historians. Now, sometimes they're pulling some of the absurdity out of the medieval period and admiring that, which, like, as I said, there were things about the medieval period that needed to be reformed. And the Protestants, as far as that goes, had a point to make. But the overarching thesis of the Middle Ages as dark and superstitious and barbaric, I think it's on the way out. I really do. I think that narrative is on the way out the door, and more people are starting to, even secular historians that are starting to see the value, because you can't rip apart medieval Europe and the glory of medieval Europe, you can't rip that apart from the faith that these people had, right? The reason that the cathedrals are so beautiful and they inspire us hundreds of years later is because of the piety and the devotion that these people had towards Christ and the cross. Okay. So, anyways, guys, that's all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. I will see you next time. God bless you all.